Great, we'll get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ornament's Refracted Cosmologies Colloquium. This colloquium is brought to you by the Yale School of Architecture, the Franke Program in Science and the Humanities, and the Macmillan Center at Yale. Today's event, titled Making Ornament, Past, Present, Future, is the last installment of the colloquium series. We've had a fantastic turnout for the past few events. Thank you to all the speakers who have volunteered their time to share their thoughts on ornament, and thank you to the enthusiastic audience members who have attended. Your questions and thoughts are incredibly valuable. If you missed any of the talks or want an encore, you're in luck because the recordings will be posted at the Yale School of Architecture YouTube channel, as well as our colloquium event page.
And if you want to get in touch with us or submit any feedback about the colloquium, any thoughts about all four of the last lectures, please head over to the Contact Us page at yaleornament.wordpress.com. We'd really love to hear about your interest in ornament and keep the conversation going.
So now we welcome you to today's talk on making ornament with Gary Hutt and Matt McNicholas. We are your hosts and moderators. I'm Cassandra Leyva, Yale Architecture Class of 2019, and the visual artist and architectural designer and work at Centerburg Architects. I first encountered ornament when taking Kent's course at Yale and became infatuated with the ways in which the field of ornament bridges between the boundaries between diverse disciplines, as well as how something so ancient can transcend time and be so relevant to today's fast-paced world.
And I'm Misha Semyonov, also Yale Architecture Class of 2019, as well as the Yale School of the Environment Class of 19. I've gotten to sneak some ornament into my work as an architect at Centerbrook. The relationship of ornament to biophilia and our brain's need for natural patterns has long been a huge interest of mine. I'm also really interested in how digital fabrication plays into the future of ornament. Those are some of the things that our speakers today are going to discuss. So a note for participants, please mute yourselves during the presentation and keep yourselves muted. We do hope that a very lively discussion will follow Gary and Matt's presentations. After they've done speaking, please start typing your questions and thoughts into the chat box. We'll ask the authors of the questions to unmute themselves one by one. We'll call on you, but to avoid any excessive feedback, please be sure to keep your mic on mute unless you are asking a question. If you have any issues at all, please feel free to chat us during the call directly.
So it is our great pleasure to introduce to you today our two guest speakers, Gary Hutt and Matthew McNicholas. Gary has a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University and a PhD from Yale University. He's a licensed architect and a tenure-track research fellow at Zhejiang University School of Art and Archaeology. I know Gary from one of the studio courses I took at the Yale School of Architecture. He was one of the teaching assistants, or a teaching assistant for a studio whose participants had the immense privilege of flying to Japan for a week. And while there, I was so validated to see someone else obsessing over the intricate door hinges and gorgeous woodwork of some of the old temples we got to visit. And then one evening when we were walking to see Sana's studio, we struck up a conversation about ornament, and I got to get a glimpse into his research on a particular period of French ornament and the aesthetic and social and political conversations it inspired at the time. Gary has collaborated on material with ornamenter Camp Bloomer, including the natures of ornament Festschrift, and I'm excited to see where Gary takes his profound knowledge and enthusiasm for ornament. Tonight he will be speaking about ornament from a historian's point of view, which will make for a very interesting conversation with our other speaker.
Matt McNicholas is a very rare specimen indeed. He's a living, breathing, contemporary ornament designer, as you can definitely tell from his firm's beautiful logo. So Matt has been practicing for more than 15 years, and he's created designs and ornamental details for buildings in 7 countries and on 4 continents. He co-founded MGLM Architects in Chicago, the home of American geniuses Sullivan and Wright, great ornamenters, in 2009, and then MGLM Interiors in 2013. He's since won a full docket of local and national awards, and his practice is rapidly expanding. He travels the world, well, probably in pre and post-COVID times, lecturing on the subject of architectural ornament. He has a Bachelor of Architecture and a Master of Architectural Design and Urbanism from the University of Notre Dame. And as some of you might find very exciting after watching our last lecture on ornament and neuroscience, he also holds an executive certificate in neuroscience and architecture from the New School of Architecture and Design. So we're really excited to hear what he has to say about his lifelong passion today. So without further ado, let's welcome Gary to go ahead and get started. After Gary and Matt both present, we'll have them engage in a dialogue and ask each other some questions before opening the floor up to the audience. But as you feel inspired and are listening to the talks, you can feel free to start typing questions into the chat, and we'll get to them once Gary and Matt have finished presenting. So please, Gary, the floor is yours.
All right, I'll start sharing my screen. This will stop others. Yeah, okay. All right, is that working? It's a white screen. Okay, cool. Well, first of all, thank you, Cassandra and Misha, for the kind invitation. It means a lot, especially having graduated during the height of the pandemic and moved away from New Haven to now be part of this symposium, which was originally planned in the days before Zoom. But and nevertheless, I'm thankful for them, for you, for bringing us all together now again. So when asked to contribute a historical reading as a kind of supplement or a counterpoint to the topic of ornaments design and production, which I'm very much looking forward to hearing about from Matt, I decided that it would be also very interesting to speak in my portion about the presentation and consumption of ornament in history, which is a topic that I believe is crucial to our understanding not only of ornament, but also of architecture's relationship to modernity. And I will just say as a quick disclaimer that the material in this talk is still very much under development. It's not fully fleshed out. So in a way, it's still very much experimental, an experimental collection of things that I hope to put on the table that may stir a discussion and which I hope will prove relevant to the forum. And so if I'm able to say so for myself, the sort of the task of bridging between, I think, artistic and scientific realms, which has been the kind of one of the themes, major themes of the last few talks, is a really difficult one, and perhaps is even more difficult under the present climate of sort of rather strict divisions between academic fields, which is as much a problem in the arts as it is in the sciences. In any case, it's certainly one aspect which has drawn me to ornament in my own study, and I'm excited to attempt to bridge this division with the other contributors in this discussion. So with that out of the way, a central concept in this talk will be that of the ornament as a fragment, and as a fragment which reflects, I think, a concept which reflects the way that ornament is consumed, especially in the 19th century, where my focus is. And what I mean by fragment is simply the part as a part which, rather than being depicted in relation to a whole, or in this case, ornament in relation to a building, but rather that through the aesthetics of its own incompleteness, recalls a kind of absent whole. And that seems kind of complicated, but I'm going to try to ground it immediately. So two types of media, which I would say exemplify this idea of the fragment, gained their prominence and maturation in the 19th century. The first is the printed book, and the second is the plaster cast. The former remains still the primary way in which we consume ornament, even today. If we think about how ornament is presented through books, it's perhaps for reasons of impracticality that we rarely study actually all of the details of a single building. Rather, we often take in ornament from a great multitude of sources, from dictionaries and encyclopedia. Such books play a crucial role, which we do not always take into consideration when consulting them, which is that they organized ornament in a variety of ways before presenting them back to us. Many of the most well-known examples we are already undoubtedly familiar with. Owen Jones's The Grammar of Ornament, for example, utilizes the sort of classical category of nations or civilizations in order to make its point about the universality of ornament as a language. And then I would just like to note also the composition of many of the plates here, their symmetry, their scale, their coloration, which will be important later in this talk. We also have, as an example, Cesar Dali's Franco-centric motifs historiques, in which the ornaments are specifically referred to as fragments, and which follows a scheme of successive French monarchs from Francis I to Louis XIV, in order to illustrate the quote-unquote evolution, as it were, of modern French architectural style from the Renaissance to the French Revolution. And Domech's Der Ornamentenschatz sort of combines the two approaches, in which a survey of ornament from ancient Egypt to Greece and Rome, China, India, Japan, which is also evident in Jones and Racinet, moving through Persian, Arabic, Byzantine ornament, and ends in the Italian and French and ultimately German Renaissance, illustrates the question of ornament and style, as it was often the case, a not so veiled question of the direction of the national art of the author's home nation. It should be noted that while on the surface, many of these texts appear to be somewhat similar and are oftentimes grouped together under the extremely vague category of 19th century style books, that they actually contain a great diversity of spatial and temporal energies in their creation. For example, neither Owen Jones' study on the Alhambra nor Gottfried Semper's 1834 thesis on polychromy in classical antiquity neither would have been possible without the physical travel of the authors to Spain and Greece, respectively. And likewise, many of the detailed plates of Cesar Dali's motifs historiques are in fact reconstructions of buildings destroyed in the urban renewal of Paris, continued famously by Haussmann, and are as such a form of preservation or even protest against the wanton destruction of historically important artifacts and architecture. So right away we can see that sort of preservation and conservation are part of the purpose of these drawings. Still other more contemporary examples follow a journalistic approach, which tracks the ornaments of newly completed prominent buildings and expositions. In Paris, for example, on the pages of Dali's Revue Générale, as in this drawing out of many, depicting a recently completed facade for a house at Crécy by Joseph Louis II, or here, a detail of an iron railing in Paris. And both of these latter examples are subjected to the practice of alphabetical, following Dali, we have Antonin Ragonet's Materia Document, and both of these latter examples are subjected to the practice of alphabetical recompilation, especially the Materia Document, which becomes literally a kind of dictionary of elements that suppresses through a kind of scrambling any kind of coherent chronology or naturalistic framework. So what's missing here is the categories of nations or even nature. The thesis that I would like to briefly present today can be summed up by a kind of pairing between the visual fragment and the imagined whole, which finds resonance in the ornament not only on the printed page but also as a physical object. Although seen as a traditional form of art or even cultural heritage, the display and method of viewing ornament in the 19th century was intimately connected to the technological and spatial developments of the time, namely the passenger train, the camera, the exhibition hall. While the railroad in France, for example, allowed archaeologists, architects, or even amateur historians to journey across the country to see historical buildings and ruins on site in what would have been prohibitive to the middle classes prior to the 19th century. The train also enabled traveling craftsmen and artists to bring pieces of those buildings back with them to Paris in the form of plaster molds, where they could be recast as accurate fragments. Examples of French Gothic architecture appearing in the Materiaux Documents after 1879, for example, are almost certainly drawn from the Museum of Comparative Sculpture, today called the Museum of French Monuments in Paris, which contains monumental scale moldings of portals, windows, friezes, capitals, etc., mostly from cathedrals built in the 12th to 18th centuries. The dense collection of fragments displayed in the large interior rooms of the Trocadero Palace, initially left vacant after the exposition of 1878, are the product of a combined initiative by Viollet-le-Duc and the curator Paul Deschamps for the preservation and promotion of the legacy of French national architecture. Strolling through the exhibition hall, Parisian visitors are met with a vast field of disjointed ornaments, which are in art form of their own, and whose fragmenting effect offers a spatial mirroring of the experience of moving, or rather strolling from one piece to the other, not unlike the casual perusal of images in reference books. A comparable and more, by the way, this is still very much there today. You can make sure to visit when you're in Paris next time. A comparable and more famous institution might be, of course, the cast court at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And then as an aside, the typology of the fragment brings up, at least for me, not only the idea of a kind of part that claims the whole, in this case, somehow the idea of the history of architecture, but also the opposite, which is the whole, which recalls the absent fragment as seen in Shumi's museum in Athens. In her book on plaster monuments, Mari Lending, the historian, has noted that these fragments take on an idealized air as objects. Sheltered indoors, they are also the favorite subject of 19th century architectural photographs, far over images captured on site. For obvious reasons, they are stationary, you don't have to travel, sort of much easier to take than photos of people because of the long exposure times of early cameras. Such images take on, of course, then a life of their own as photographs featured in specialty galleries or as part of the numerous expositions of the period, where they are invariably organized once again according to subject, to type, to location, etc. They also travel further in unique ways as the popularity of postcards became more popular, for example. I think it is a worthwhile topic to contemplate. What do we see, or rather, what do we imagine that we are seeing when we view ornaments, or rather architecture, in this way? And perhaps in the context of this talk in particular, the question ought to be, what are the consequences for the design process and for the making of ornament? What is the pedagogical function for the individual element or the motif? Which is often how it was kind of referred to. One avenue of exploring this question is to begin with the fact that such concepts are not born in a vacuum, but have their own history in modern thought. From the Italian motif, the motif, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, signified the primitive and principal idea upon which the musical composer determines the subject and arranges a design. It is the underlying motivation to act in a particular way, to commit certain things to paper over others. The motif presents a primordial artistic intuition driven by an almost impulsive inner creativity. It is, in essence, the image of romanticism, which would at first glance have very little to do with some of the more scientific aspects, which have already been discussed in this forum. But I would argue that this is not entirely true. The 19th century was the period also in which historicism and naturalism became conjoined, or conflated is perhaps a better term. In the aforementioned Cesar Dali's Motifs Historiques, for example, the motif is given as the fragment which, upon its artistic transformation by the recombination of historical forms, disappears, as it were, into the new form, which emerges from this process. He is describing the design process, a process likened explicitly to that of evolution in nature. At the same time, it is not really a stretch to connect Dali's idea of the architectural fragment to that of the specimen in the natural sciences, which implies a classification into groups, classes, or types. In the same publication, Dali argues that architecture's continued stylistic progress requires a language which is equal in rigor to that of the species, as well as a method of organization and observation by which resemblances and differences may be parsed. So even though figures like Dali still considered neoclassical formalism the primary pedagogical engine of the École des Beaux-Arts at mid-century as the basis for architectural innovation, already in the mid-19th century, the idea of the ornament, considered a primary unit of this formalism, was beginning to be organized around an epistemology of comparison and the observation of minute difference and similarity, rather than strictly enforced orders or hierarchies. It also moves, as we see with Raguenet, away from the pedagogy of the analytique, which relied on the skillful composition of details by the architect. Rather, the space of the background becomes like a tray upon which examples are placed. In fact, Raguenet follows a system of classification already established, but not yet fully elaborated by Dali in the Motifs Historiques, in which grouping by type becomes primary above all else. For example, the column, the capital, the balcony, the balustrade, the frame, the panel, the rose ornament, the vase, etc. So it must be said that these thoughts so far have been based primarily on visual observation, while there are plenty of texts by Dali, Viollet-le-Duc, or others in the 19th century, which have all been studied quite extensively in the past 2 decades or so, which suggests that there was some connection between the study of architecture and the study of plants and organisms, for example, whether by concepts of classification or dissection. And while much attention has been drawn to the effect which such kinds of naturalisms have had on the discourse of architectural historicism, especially of this period, including its darker racial contents, I think that it's fair to say on a very general level that architects of the 19th century, much like architects today, probably did not consider themselves as scientists, and certainly did not proclaim that they were doing science. Rather, there was a kind of conscious interchange and a free borrowing, particularly in the realm of representation. And I would argue that this borrowing was not one directional. In other words, I feel like in a lot of the scholarship, recent scholarship, it's the emphasis is on how architects sort of digest these ideas into our discipline. But I would like to show at least one case study in which the opposite sort of happens. So well before the advent of photography capable of capturing the microscopic scale, naturalists of this period also relied on illustrations to depict their findings, none of which are more famous than Ernst Haeckel's Kunstformen der Natur, first published in 1899, I think, based on the findings of the HMS Challenger mission conducted from 1872 to 1876 by the Royal Society of London, as well as other deep sea studies of the time. The famous plates of the elaborate forms of radiolarians, medusae, siphonophores, and sponges were transformed by Haeckel's from Haeckel's sketches to these colored drawings by the lithographer Edward Gilch and his son Adolf Gilch, both of whom had collaborated with Haeckel throughout their lives. It is interesting to note, even if just as an aside, the similarity of artistic technique between some of these plates and, for example, the Grammar of Ornament in terms of their use of color or the symmetrical organization on the page. And this was, of course, 50 years, almost half a century later. An article from the journal Science noted in 1887 that Haeckel was extremely fortunate to have Adolf Gilch as a collaborator, and nowhere is this sentiment clearer than in the obituary for the artist written by Haeckel himself and published in the Jena daily paper on June 28th of 1911. In honoring Gilch's memory, Haeckel notes that the artist, nearly 20 years his junior, was not only skilled in performing the task of translating working sketches, described as often highly deficient or poorly drawn, into a finished or polished image, as most lithographers do, but wanted to, quote, above all, gain an exact knowledge and a thorough understanding of the depicted object for himself, and only based on this to execute the sharp contours and the most appropriate shading of the figures, end quote. So over 42 years, Adolf Gilch created more than 400 plates in a large folio format for Haeckel, which resulted in publications such as the Kunstformen der Natur, which gained the artist a wide reputation and many opportunities. In an interesting note, Haeckel notes that Gilch turned down many of these offers, and preferring to, quote, stay in his modest house in Tinnergasse, formerly occupied by Friedrich Schiller, to retain the advantages of a medium-sized business with full personal freedom, end quote, citing the Goethean joy of possessing art and science as, quote, the true religion, end quote, over the accumulation of material wealth. Ending his note, Haeckel cites a newspaper clipping from the Norddeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, noting the death of the doctor of philosophy Adolf Gilch. And he cites this for the reason to state that actually Adolf Gilch never received a doctorate in his lifetime, and therefore this attribution must have come from one of Haeckel's students in Jena who studied with Gilch and who referred to him as Herr Dr. Gilch. Unlike the idea that illustrations of ornament in the 19th century had any kind of scientific purpose or ambition, the ornamenting quality of Gilch's drawings for Haeckel are immediately and concretely manifest in Haeckel's own home in Jena. For example, as a ceiling painting in place of where a traditional circular mural might be, said to be due to the fact that Haeckel was working on his monograph on Medusae while the house was being built. I'm sorry, I could not find a better photo. This is the highest resolution one that I could get, but you can see the actual plate from where it comes from. It's nearly identical, and this is from the Haeckel house in Jena. Or this undated and unnamed shelf, done clearly in the style of the plates of the Kunstformen der Natur. And once again, you can actually see the exact drawing from which the ornament came from. And the most famous example would, of course, be the architect René Binet's entrance gate for the Exposition Universelle, the 1900. Sorry, that's one more plate from the shelf, which is quite nice. The most famous example would be René Binet's entrance gate for the Exposition Universelle of 1900, whose design is specifically attributed to Haeckel's study of the Challenger expedition. In a letter to Haeckel in 1899, Binet claims that he examined Haeckel's work from an artistic standpoint, quote, in the interest of architecture and of ornamentation, end quote. About the monumental gate, Binet writes, quote, everything about it, from the general composition to the smallest details, has been inspired by your studies, end quote. And indeed, in his book, Esquisses Decoratives, published in 1900, these inspirations are made vividly clear. The introduction text written by the art critic and historian Gustave Geoffroy credits explicitly the Challenger voyage headed by Wyville Thomson and Haeckel's subsequent study as gifting the Radiolarian to Binet, as well as other forms of an invisible world, which Binet makes visible through architecture and all of its composite elements, the balconies, the balustrades, the capitals, mosaics, tapestries, vases, etc., even going so far, and this is a bit of a stretch, to call the achievement a step in human evolution. The plates of the book are even more telling, done in a style which clearly mimics Gilcher's work, both formally and compositionally. It is extremely interesting to note that there is a mimicry in not only the shape, but also the density of form. In some instances, it is as if a process of scalar multiplication had been applied without regard to concerns over fabrication, which must have been in actuality very much carefully considered and negotiated. And if one had the time, I surmise that it would have even been possible to guess which plates of Gilcher's served as the primary inspiration for each of Binet's designs. So what I've presented is not necessarily new research. Haeckel's influence on Binet is well documented and also somewhat obvious, but I think it is important to note, to point out the role of the artwork and its relationship to objects and their ordering thereof. Today, or at least in the last few decades, it has become somewhat common or even trendy to put the question of order under critical scrutiny, and for good reason. Also well documented, for example, are Haeckel's highly problematic and racist views on human evolution, developed in the decades prior to the publication of the Kunstformen der Natur, and which would unsurprisingly later become very attractive to regimes such as Hitler's. And simultaneously, the primacy of Gilcher's illustrations in Haeckel's works, also from this period, were accused by his scientific peers as being presented as substitutions for evidence. And I'm no expert in this matter, but against such controversial backdrops, it's very interesting to consider, I think, for example, the opinion of the American writer of the aforementioned issue from the 1887 edition of the journal Science, who lamented that while unquestionably beautiful, the Kunstformen der Natur presented an utterly chaotic view of systematic biology, as if that of, quote, an anarchist toward the civil law, and like that, if adopted by all naturalists, would be likely to result in an indefinite number of individual despotisms, end quote. So you can see the kind of heavy bias towards evolutive narratives here. I'm sorry that this is perhaps does not lead to any kind of clean conclusion, as history seldom does. Binet is only one prominent case in which architecture of what we might today call biophilia a term coined by the American biologist Edward O. Wilson. But it is absolutely necessary, I believe, to approach the ordering of biology from a critical perspective, which does not remove the instrumentality of reason. So I've been asked to say a few words about how I approach the history and design of ornament in my own teaching and practice, which I must say resides in the same space of ambiguity, somewhere between the promotion of beauty and the cautioning of restraint. It is useful for me to think about, for example, how less impactful Haeckel's sketches would be had he not found a lifelong hand in Gilch, his attenuation to color, to composition, a maturity of training in the aesthetic traditions of his time, and the reconstructions of organisms as artistic fragments and not the other way around. So that is my talk, and thank you very much. I'm looking very much forward to hearing from Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. That was really fantastic. A lot of amazing images you have compiled there. I think it's very fitting that we've been talking about plaster casts and ornament specimens, and Matt is calling in from his office in Chicago, where he has a beautiful plaster cat of Sullivan's ornament right behind his head. So with that, we'll transition over to Matt.
Take it away.
Okay. Not exactly a halo, but it'll do, I think. All right. So I was going to praise technology a little bit here, but it's giving me fits. So I appreciate everyone's patience with the transitions I'll have midway through this presentation. But I'd like to start by saying, just many thanks to Cass and Misha for inviting me to participate and for organizing this colloquium. And thanks for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be part of anything ornament, especially alongside such distinguished fellows. And Gary, that was absolutely fascinating. I've got a list of questions for you later. So I've been studying and practicing ornament for more than 20 years, and I'm still surprised with all the knowledge, the new knowledge on this massive topic. So with that, I'd like to start by just giving you a little outline here. First, we'll look at how ornament should incorporate reference and derive inspiration from nature, at least from my perspective. Second, we'll quickly look at some principles of ornament. Third, we'll look at some production from drawings to actual elements. And finally, I'll attempt to do a little live demo here and hopefully don't fall flat on my face. So I would say that there isn't enough time tonight to go into all the elements of ornament, but I'd like to touch on a few that are related to nature, that font of all inspiration here. So in my opinion, the greatest ornament is derived from the fountainhead herself, Mother Nature. If we study her, we cannot be led astray. No form, detail, arrangement, composition, color scheme, or depth of field has ever been incorrect when Mother Nature herself creates it. We must always look to her for any advancement in the ornamental arts, not only because she's the font of all knowledge, but because of the direct benefits that ornament derived from nature has on stress regulation and our physiological health, as we heard from Richard Taylor and Nico Salangaros in the last session. There are fundamental principles, proportions, rules, and tricks that nature employs, and ornamental systems should draw inspiration and guidance from them. The best ornament is not a servile copy of nature, but an application of her principles, an ordering of the chaos, or the so-called chaos, and a conventionalization that is informed by application and then the materials in production. Flowers naturally provide color and form and offer a wide array of inspiration in and of themselves, but plants are, of course, by no means the only sources of ornamental inspiration in nature. Many cultures closely observe the habits and characteristics of fauna to inform some of their ornament. For example, the movement and structure of animals or the flight of birds and insects. Or the movement, I'd say the movement of planetary bodies also generate inspiration for ornament, as seen here in the pentagram of Venus, which links the orbits of Venus and the Earth around the Sun, or by the geocentric view of the orbit of Mars as drawn by Johann Kepler in 1609, or even in patterns created in movement around a black hole. An effective and talented practitioner of ornament will always keep nature and her principles at front of mind, drawing inspiration from even the simplest elements. with study and practice, entire ornamental themes can be derived from even the most humble natural element. Speaking of elements, let's look at a couple that traditionally inform ornament, as Gary showed in so many of those beautiful slides there. Swags, festoons, and rosettes are all obvious in their inspiration, all part of a floriated or foliated ornament. Spirals obviously derived from shells, some animal horns or tusks, coiling of snakes, tendrils of plants, eddies of water, curls of human hair, and wisps of smoke that all kind of inform line work together. The guilloche pattern consists of overlapping spirals, but I don't think it's any coincidence that this pattern also closely resembles moisture dynamics in the form of a Kármán street vortex. And then one of my favorites is the wave scroll, which some posit derives literally from waves, but I submit they actually derive from clouds. This known as the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability wave phenomenon in cloud formation. So diving into some of the principles, I have about 25 or 26 different principles on the practice of ornament. I usually do this in a 2-day course, but in the interest of time, we'll just look at a couple here. So starting with symmetry and balance, or that which includes localized symmetry or implied symmetry. Symmetry is the effect produced by the repetition of any form on an axis. It's the hallmark of unity and order, and it conveys nobility of style. In nature, symmetry and or balance is almost a universal law. Balance is the impression of similar concord in the arrangement of dissimilar forms. It is perhaps best seen in trees where branches are not typically arranged symmetrically, but rather with an overall balance. And not surprisingly, as a repeating self-similar fractal, leaves rarely have both sides identical like a butterfly, but rather the leaf is balanced by the impression of symmetry. Radiation is self-evident, the spreading out or divergence of lines or forms from a point of common origin. It's almost universal in nature, from the rays of the sun to the petals of a sunflower. It exists in the branching of tree limbs and roots, fingers on a hand, and the arms of starfish. Interchange is the dividing up equally of horizontal and vertical patterns, or inverting the color and ground from one side to the other. Counterchange is a striking form of contrast, typically found in fabrics and mosaics, which a pattern is created by the juxtaposition of stark contrast of the same shape, typically strongly geometric, and interlocked in rotation and orientation rather than the more simple interchange of contrast along axis. And finally, for our purposes today, unity. So unity infers a complete idea that grew from an initial coherent impulse. Unification of form and idea are the cooperation of all the parts of the piece of ornament or ornamental theme, and is essential to good ornamental design. So here's the part where I'm going to have to switch software. So bear with me a minute here, because I'd like to talk about production of ornament. All right. Is that showing there? Back up.
Looking good.
All right. All right, so I'm going to tone down my compliments of technology at this point. But looking at some elements from drawing to production by both hand and machine, fortunately for me or for us, but unfortunately for this presentation, much of what we do is held confidentially, but I pulled some things here to kind of hopefully give a quick idea. So what we're seeing here is a bee medallion that's been designed for a family of beekeepers to go outside in their in the area where all of the hives will be kept. And so we've created in a hexagonal form here an interlocking design that represents the paths that bees will dance when they're communicating the information of the pollen stashes that they found. And by using the geometries coming together in these shapes, we've also created 7 stars there around inside the hexagon, which represents each member of the family, or 7 members of the family. So working through some of the imagery here. Here's only half of it was carved in walnut, so this is just the sort of process stuff. Doing it old school. Louis Sullivan used to write on the photos that were sent to him of the ornament, and would white out things and scratch, and so we've done it digitally here. So we make the comments and we kind of ask the suggestions and ask if some of the other elements are possible. And I should mention this. This was carved by Patrick Burke, who's out of Wisconsin, an incredible carver and designer. So look him up if you get a chance. And then just some more pictures of the process. Here's the walnut panel delivered, and there's the half mold made because we have to make the full prototype. And so there's the two halves together as they're almost in that final prototype piece, because this will be cast in bronze and mounted outside. So that's Patrick's feet there in the image. We've sent it through. Here's another just drawing, CAD drawing to finish art glass design and the kind of the weaving of the natural and the geometric together. Some more images of art glass going together. So I thought it might be fun to look at the artisans at work. This one in particular had more than 280,000 pieces that were assembled in 2 different studios by more than a dozen people. You know, we do this kind of work because we enjoy it, but it's also effectively a jobs program. You know, the more detail you put into a building, the more people kind of have to get on board and execute it. So it's an economic driver. Here is let's go back one. Here's a panel. This is Kala. So those of you familiar with some of the mythology in Southeast Asia might recognize this. It's a carving that typically goes over doorways found in Hindu and Buddhist temples, and it signifies time. It's a mythological demigod that's consuming himself. He's consumed his entire body, but he's also consuming all of nature as this kind of passage of time. It's sort of an apotropaic symbol. So we had that carved for the project, and then we designed this door here with a handle on top where the top part of it is the progenitor to the fleur-de-lis, this project being located in France. And the cast bronze hardware is then complemented with lavender petals in a sort of decorative molding around the escutcheon plates and underneath the top of the handle there. And lavender embodies cleanliness, so the idea is that your hands are cleansed as you enter the building. This one, we created a fence for a high school. So this is the school's shield here in the middle, and these are decorative panels that we actually modeled in SketchUp and then had them CNC'd in a very large pattern in a hard wax. A resin that would then cast a solid aluminum panel, and they were later painted. So you can kind of see the SketchUp to the fabricated element there, which kind of turned out quite nice, I thought. So that about wraps up the production part. I'd like to do a little summation here before moving on to a demo. And I'd like to go back to my roots. It was in college when I read Kent Bloomer's Nature of Ornament. I actually wrote an email, said, "Hey, can I work for you?" And I think the response I got back was like, "You know, we don't have any positions open, but good luck." And so that's kind of my roots. But I do agree with Kent when he said in the Nature of Ornament, quote, "The knowledge required to produce ornament belonging to our age cannot spontaneously emerge. While the impulse to ornament may be intuitive, while we can readily afford ornament, and while there are any number of craftspeople, architects, painters, and sculptors willing to begin work on it, the language of ornament, like the languages of speech and music, must be nourished by active procedures of renewal and education. There is simply not enough time within each successive generation of designers and artisans to reinvent the complex grammar and visual eloquence that are manifest in the most outstanding projects in the past," end quote. So this is my little boy. I've been indoctrinating him with all the details of buildings, kind of lift him up to to touch the claws of the eagle or point out the sleepy giant, and probably running for her life. But that's what we need to do, is kind of educate the successive generations. So that makes me extra appreciative for what's going on today. All right, I am going to shift to the demo here. What I'd like to do is kind of take you through a quick process. So, you know, hopefully this is of some value. It's going to be relatively, you know, simple and straightforward here. Just driving inspiration into a decorative pattern. So, you can tell me if you can see my mouse there. Is it
Looking good.
looking good? Okay, great. All right, so what I did is I went out earlier and took some photos of the redbud tree in a park across the street that's blossoming, because I kind of like the structure, and these are tiny little blossoms. But I was figuring maybe we can do something here. So, you know, if we're looking at, I selected those principles that we discussed on purpose, because the idea is that we would then try to apply some of them. So this is going to be very sketchy in the interest of time, but you know, if we kind of go through and make some sections or some illustrative elements that represent that sort of initial thought, that initial genesis of the idea. And I'm using this particular layout here because because when you do it in a rectilinear pattern, it can get pretty static. So I've oriented things on their side here. And the idea is that each one of these little scribbles here might be developed then further like the bud, like the red bud would, or even, you know, if you're electing to do things in a stylistic way, you can change it to you know, say an Art Deco idiom, or give it more of a naturalistic feel to go into perhaps the arts and crafts, or the Art Nouveau. So if I do this correctly, we should get a repeating pattern that then we can extrapolate into something else. So while we're looking at this design here, the idea is that, change my idea here. The idea is that you can take this, you can develop a motif. This kind of goes back to what Gary was saying a little bit about motifs. You know, I like to think of it along the lines of a module, where you can create one element that then informs so many of the other elements that you would be utilizing in the building, right? So if I line these up in this way, you'll notice there, this kind of goes back to something that Nikos had mentioned last week, or just prior, in terms of that sort of static repetition. The idea is that we're not just repeating the same element over and over in a static way, but giving it a rotation, and that rotation will give some vibrancy to the overall effect here, ideally. So if I get these lined up, then we should be able to see, I'll show you a tool I use to judge other elements of it. All right, so there's a quick, very rough overall pattern. But then in order to judge the solids and the voids, if I want to do anything else to it, I'm going to go ahead and take it and look at it at a different scale. Scale is very important. I think, as we've heard already from, again, last week from Nikos, if we're following along the lines of nature, we're going to want to be designing at all scales. We're going to want to have elements that that work, you know, for example, on door handles or on large friezes, et cetera. All of that range in between. So when I scale it down like this, you can start to see what's happening and where maybe some opportunities exist to fill in. So we kind of got a circular element here, and then we have almost a diamond shape here, and then we can change this in the square. So there's a few different things going on, and this gives an opportunity then to look at it with another element. Let's say maybe layering here. Now we start to think about what the materiality is, right? So right now we're in a two-dimensional condition, and I will not attempt to put shadow on this because I think everyone will be quite bored by that effort. But we can do this in a few different ways. So you can see how layering in here can kind of give that scale. So you would do it then depending on whether or not it's being, or where it's being used and how it's being used, the kind of decorum of the element, right? One of my favorite turns of phrase is that decorum is important, and we know that you know, in terms of scale, because you know, while it's still a brush, you wouldn't use a broom as a toothbrush, and so you kind of use those aspects to the scale and the purpose to inform how much you're putting in. And so then let's see what that might look like in door frame. So we could take this detail here and we could use it at the top of the building in a very simplistic way, like a repeating pattern. But if we took this motif and we said, you know, okay, it's red bud inspired. We've got the central element going on it. How can we use that to inform the design of our door and keep it in that same family? So what I would do in this instance then is I predetermined lights here. I feel like it's one of those baking shows where you pull the baked thing already out of the oven. But you can scale this element down and use it in a way that maybe gives an opportunity to see it as art glass or carved pattern. For this, let's just do both. So moving these around, then maybe we look at where the caming, if it's a leaded glass, would go. So obviously we're not going to have those floating lines, but we can start to, you know, change things here and define our elements in colored glass and not. And that really emphasizes some of the forms then as they repeat in a different way. So we'll take this form here and copy it over. And then we kind of repeat those throughout. These would be colored. Obviously, they look a little stark in this condition, but hopefully we can start to see this repeat. So take that again, flip it again, and now we have an array across this door. If you think about these as glass and leaded work that have both our original repeat, where you can kind of see, you know, this shape here and color, and then the corners, and then that this rotates from here to here, and so on and so forth down the glass. So that's one way to take that motif and utilize it so you're kind of staying in the same family. And then I'll do one more quick one here, wherein we will look at it as a carved panel. And then I'm going to show you one last thing here. So bringing down that central panel there, just scaling it to this predetermined size. Now we've got an element here that we can work into perhaps carving. So bring these lines through on either side, and then we can work maybe in the idiom of arts and crafts, or even in Art Nouveau, where we kind of use the structure here to grow off a central element. That was always one of Louis Sullivan's mantras, is to remember that energy line where the growth comes from. You can kind of see it at the center there. And then just take that piece. I should have done this on a different layer, but that's okay. And just like that, you've got a door and panelization and a frieze that works perhaps works for an overall building. Again, really sketchy, really quick, but just to give you a sense of what's possible here, just with this very simple layout. I had sketched some others, so it could be something like that, could be something like that. These are all just derived from the redbud. And then if you throw some shade and shadow on, you can turn your two-dimensional element into a three-dimensional motif there, and you kind of start to pull out how deep it is, how much relief there is along the elements, where it goes. Use that to inform a number of different things. But also, perhaps most importantly, to help inform the artisans who are creating such elements, because there's nothing better than a very informative drawing. And so that's kind of my little demo there. Hopefully, it was useful in some ways. I think I'd like to finish by saying. My part of this tonight has been really about, the design of ornament and principles, but there's so much more, I think, as we all know, with regard to even the things we've talked about in the colloquium, but the psychological and sociological benefits, such as memory making and wayfinding, cultural identity, the sense of touch, imagination, impoverished versus enriched environments, stimulus independent thought, activation of the default network of the brain, all these things that ornament does in an incredible way, in addition to the other aspects of design, which are kind of classifications, types, decorum, scaling, and the jobs aspect as well. And then finally, I'd say I just really encourage everyone to, if you're working with an artisan, allow them to bring their best to the project. We can go through this and we can kind of design different things, but the person working with the materials really has a knowledge level that can benefit the whole project. And then don't be afraid to sort of ask for more, ask for more detail, ask for a little more effort, because if we let things slide as good enough, then that may not benefit the next project. But if we're kind of demanding a little bit more out of it, then hopefully that's a sort of a feedback loop that benefits all the projects that these people who are involved in would work on. So.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. That was mesmerizing, the whole demonstration and presentation. Thank you. We both obviously grouped the two of you in this presentation together for a reason, but I'm just amazed at how well the two talks really talk to each other.
Yeah, I love how we went from looking at sort of categorization of botanical and biological elements and finished up with the redbud becoming a motif and inspiring a pattern of ornament that was really, really magical. Thank you both for putting together such different but very well meshed talks.
Just feeling really inspired right now.
So I know that you guys, that Matt and Gary have some questions for each other, so we'll let you guys get started on that. But everyone in the audience, please don't be shy to start typing your questions into the chat. And after our first discussion between Gary and Matt, we will definitely address your questions.
So if you would like to say your question, we'll call on you and you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, you let us know if you want us to read your question.
Yep.
So Matt, I guess I'll start. First of all, thank you for that talk. It was really, as Cassandra said, mesmerizing. I realized that I'd never seen it done live. That I've always studied like a finished work. I've never actually seen it just sort of come to life like that. And it took me a while to figure out that you were actually drawing on the spot, which was just really impressive. So thank you again for that. I have a bunch of questions. So my first one is regards to something that actually wasn't part of your presentation, but I think is really interesting. which is your own. How did you actually come about learning about ornament in your education? Because I think, you know, in places like Yale, if you don't take Kent Bloomer's class, it's pretty difficult to find a kind of you know, attitudes for or against, basically. So I mean, they mentioned, you know, Misha mentioned that you were a graduate of Notre Dame. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about your own education and upbringing and the attitudes there, how they might differ from what we went through. Yeah,
Thanks. In particular for the kind words at the beginning there. I hope it didn't. I hope it actually was a decent little presentation, but I appreciate it. And thanks for the question. I have thought about this a little bit because I don't have anything but self-education really in ornament. I made my Master of Architectural Design and Urbanism into an ornament master's. She said, like, well, I'm here and I'm paying, so I'll do whatever I want to do. But I did grow up in a house that had a lot of furniture with carved pieces, so carved clawfoots. We had like this really big Gothic chest that I called the monkey chest because it had little sprockets that looked like monkey faces on it. And I grew up around those, you know, handmade elements. And the fireplace where I used to have to make the fire had bricks with animal footprints in it. And so I used to trace the animal footprints on the bricks. And so I was kind of in an environment that had a lot of detail in different areas. And then I spent a lot of time in nature, just in the summers and growing up. So combining, you know, these carved elements and an artistic background with nature, it just, I barely finished any of my architecture projects at school. I just focused on the details too much. So that's kind of how I evolved into it, fell into it. What about yourself?
That's amazing. I really started getting into it in my doctoral studies. Before that, I was both as a student and as an architect. I wasn't really all that tuned in, to be honest. And it was, yeah, partially. I can't really quite put my finger on like the exact moment in which it sort of became a thing, but it definitely sort of grew kind of organically and both in a kind of critical sense of thinking about how ornament fits into modernity, which I think is the bigger question for me, and I think it's a sort of unresolved question. You know, that was kind of the underlying meta theme of my dissertation as well. So yeah,
I had a question for you. How do you think the authors and artists of the books actually saw the elements they were documenting? Do you think they saw them as ornamental pieces or as like fragments or art? Do we have any indications to their perspective on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that's like the big question for interpretation, because there's what they say, and then there's what is, you know, more likely the truth. So you have to balance. For example, if we just zero in on the focus of Dali, you know, he has theoretical writings where he says things like he's trying to make a scientific language. He's trying to make a more rigorous approach, and he's concerned with the actually finding a modern style, and that's something that sort of can rub multiple people the wrong way, which is the idea that 19th century neoclassicism was actually all about modernism. But you know, next to that, he also says things like, well, you know, architects these days are so busy, and clients, you know, demand all sorts of different styles, and basically, I'm also trying to help them feed themselves in a way that's manageable, because you know they're dealing with all the stresses that we deal with, which is the constraints on budgets and client demands and time and all of and like you said, no time to reinvent, or rather, as Kent said, no time to reinvent. Which actually ties into something that I wanted to ask you, which is how do you work with your clients in terms of explaining to them? I mean, do they come in with some prior knowledge of styles or history or anything like that? Because you know, like Dali mentions that in the 19th century, he kind of, it's kind of an offhand comment where he says that clients come in as amateur historians, which is kind of troublesome because they
Some things
assume
never
they
change. Yeah.
So I just wanted to know how you dealt with that in your professional work.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Some things never change, I would say. No, we have probably the gamut, right? Some people who just want a building, and some people who kind of gravitate towards the detail. We're always bringing the detail because I'm obsessed, probably unhealthily, with it, and so then it becomes an effort to say, like, well, how do you make this a part of the overall? And Kent has spoken to budget. I think Nikos touched on budget in the last meeting, but obviously people look at the like decorative stuff and they say, well, yeah, that's expensive, I'm not going to do it. The reality is that, like, we have, I think has been pointed out, we have a lot of ways of producing things nowadays that are beautiful and not, not at all as costly as they once were. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that it would pass the, the purse strings there. So what we try to do is give it meaning. We try to give it an allegorical or metaphorical or a symbolic meaning to the owner or to the client, which then kind of gives them some ownership of the project. It also is a sort of an initiation. I would say, like, the best ornament is exoteric and esoteric. So it's accessible to all in terms of its beauty, and they can perceive it, and hopefully it's dynamic and active during the day, and it modulates lights and does all those things. And then for those who are in the know, it can have some extra meaning, and that's always a really good way to kind of like pass that budget question, because then the client is kind of arguing with whether or not they want this thing for themselves instead of just this thing some designer added to it. So that's kind of how we approach it.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I guess I have one more question about, you mentioned, or you showed those slides of the artisans at work, and you also mentioned the kind of economics, or briefly touched on the economics of that kind of work. And I was just, it brought me back to, I visited Castelvecchio in Italy, the Scarpa project, and I was talking to one of the curators there just before COVID, and they were telling me that basically nobody in Italy can make that kind of craft anymore. That you can design that kind of level of detail, but there's just isn't the skill to do it, and you wouldn't be able to find someone to do it, and that's, it made me really sad, but it also so that brought up the question for me, like, in terms of the artisans, like, you must know a lot more than the rest of us about the economics of that kind of work. Like, do they do work mostly for architects and for buildings like that? And how is that, is the demand for it increasing or decreasing, and how do we support that? Because I could imagine actually even a lot of people that design quote unquote modern buildings could make a lot of make really good use of custom details and really beautiful handwork. I don't know. That's just on the top of my head. Like, how can we promote that kind of skill and culture, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is sad that a lot of craft has been lost, in the last 50 to 70 years. I think that kind of goes across the board. It's not exclusive to artisans, right, of building ornament, but they have been, for example, the Northwestern Terracotta Company used to exist in Chicagoland area, right? They made thousands of pieces of terracotta that still adorn buildings all across Chicago, 100 years later, 100 plus years later, with relatively little impact. It's an excellent building material. It's fireproofing. It has so many qualities going for it, especially in this freeze-thaw environment. And yet they were driven out of business by the desire of an architectural movement that didn't want any of their stuff anymore. It wasn't that they ran out of clay or they were mismanaged or, a big fire or some catastrophe. It was just that, times moved on. And, I think with regard to the question of the people who produce these things, they exist. They exist in a much smaller form. A lot of stuff has become very specialized to the point where, we try to operate in an ornamental theme in a kind of idea, in a holistic idea for the building or the project. And a lot of these artisans, craftspeople, carvers, plaster workers will be able to do smaller, more singular jobs, a ceiling or a piece of furniture or a balustrade or something. And we like to see it kind of come all back together. So we collect as much as we can anyone who makes and wants to keep making these kinds of things, because we want to keep sending work to try to keep all of those crafts alive as best as we can, from our point of view.
Right. Yeah, that reminds me, because I had just visited a villa here in Zhejiang province that was a kind of national historical preservation site, and I was talking to one of the preservationists, and he was saying that in China, that the situation is such that the best people can still do all the carvings, all the intricate carvings, but it's like literally a generational difference. People that can still do it are in their 60s, and the people that are in their 40s don't know how to do it, or they can't do it as well. Like the difference in skill is like markedly visible. Yeah. So that was something that I also, in recent memory, kind of a shock, I guess.
Well, that goes to the quote that I read by Kent from the book, about like how it's impossible to reinvent this in every successive generation. We have to keep it alive. We have to foster it. We have to try and make sure that we're not losing those. And it's sad to hear. But I like the idea that that it's a jobs program. That Ornament is a jobs program. Really, it's a way to employ people to beautify our built environment, which we already understand from this colloquium has an untold benefits to us on a cognitive, physiological, sociological, psychological level. So there's a return on health from beautiful buildings. And then if we can employ people to build those buildings, we're giving them useful work with their hands to work locally. And like, what's better than that, right? What's better than like, building up your environment to benefit all and doing, something that you love. I feel like there's no better solution to the economic driver problem of jobs than to make a more beautiful built environment. But that's just me. I'm kind of biased. I think there are some questions in the chat, but I feel like, Gary, we need to have a conversation off to the side here.
We should definitely stay in touch for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, let's go ahead and let our two questions, at least so far, be asked, and we can certainly keep the conversation with you two going. But looks like Nikos had his first question in. So Nikos, did you want to unmute and ask our presenters?
Sure. Hi. Thank Matt and Gary for lovely talks. And I would like to ask about 2 points. First, Matt showed us that with today's technology, we can really save enormous amount of effort and labor, but at the same time, technology does not replace labor. What technology does is enables us to recover, say, 100 years of lost knowledge by an eager person. With the technology, they can shortcut. Instead of redeveloping all the lost knowledge, I think an intelligent craftsman today, or craftswoman, armed with the technology, can relearn and redevelop the ornamental techniques. Instead of taking 100 years, it's going to take maybe 5 months. Optimistically, we have that. Louis Sullivan would be ecstatic at the potential we have today of creating ornament with the most phenomenal ornament, and then implementing it and producing it very economically. So I'm very excited with that. But then I want to ask a rather dark question of both of you. The prejudice against ornament today. There are tens of thousands of architects, architectural academics, and architecture students that believe that what both of you are saying is somehow criminal, because you are pointing out, you're pointing to the creation of ornaments which has been banned as against human nature, as against progress. Okay, now I don't want to offend Gary, but Gary is easily dismissed because someone listening to Gary will say, okay, all this stuff, you know, all these drawings, this is the 19th century. We can dismiss anything from the 19th century. It has no relevance today. So I'm sorry, Gary, but I see many of my colleagues in architecture ready to say that to you, which is unjust and unfair. But that's their, I think that's going to be the response. Matt, on the other hand, poses a real danger. He poses a real danger to the regime. You know, Matt must be suppressed at any cost, like like a dissident in a totalitarian regime, because Matt is actually producing ornament today. That is totally unacceptable. You know, the regime thought that it had totally wiped out ornament, you know, and except for a few brave souls like Kent Bloomer, you know, who is here, they managed to do that. And here Matt is actually producing ornament and building it and putting it up. So how do you two address this vast prejudice that we are facing?
Matt, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can jump in here. Thanks, Nikos. I'm worried I'll get some boot stomping down the hall here, breaking down the door momentarily. But you know, I don't think that anyone can argue with the fact that it is in our DNA to adorn our spaces, right? I've got a few different lectures that I've given over the few years, but like one has, you know, sort of like an empty dorm room, and I say without human, and then a dorm room with human, and it's just completely decorated, right? A desk, an empty desk without human, a desk with stuff all over it with human. You know, it's in our DNA to doodle, to decorate things. Donald Brown wrote a pamphlet, a short book called Human Universals, where he documents, I think it's 74 some, might be more than that, universals that are found in every single culture, and one of them is non-bodily decorative art. So it's just really in our DNA. And I actually had a client one time say to me, you know, I don't care how it looks, you know, because I was talking about like the detail and we have to do these kinds of things. He said, I don't really care how it looks. And I said to him, did you dress yourself this morning? And he looked down, he's wearing a tie and a coat. He had a really nice watch, all these things. And he looks down and he says, yeah, okay, I do care how it looks. And so it's like a pithy little simple, like, okay, you know, there are people being brainwashed, as you say, across the spectrum there. They're being told that ornament is criminal, it's Adolf Loos, it's all of these aspects, how it doesn't belong in buildings, it's primitive, it's, you know, degenerate, all of the words that were used by the mentally ill man, Adolf Loos. And the reality is that the rest of society loves ornament. They love things with detail. They buy clothes with patterns on it. They have it all over their cars. They spend money on it left, right, and center, even though they don't realize that like these are details that they want to have in their home. Throw pillows with decoration on it, the fabrics, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a small group of people who are sadly teaching architects to eliminate ornament from buildings, but the world understands that ornament is part of our DNA. That's how I would approach it. Gary?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. First, it's really funny, at least in my limited environment, maybe it's a sign of the times. People have been quite supportive of this kind of research, and people have sort of shown a lot of interest, at least to my face. Actually, the one time that someone walked out of a lecture of mine was actually I won't name him obviously, but it was a professor of classical architecture, and I was giving a talk related to this topic about how theorists of the 19th century, neoclassicists, were actually, like Dali, were not so much interested in theories of tradition or heritage or revivalism, but were actively trying to derive from what they believed, what they imposed onto the motif, a kind of pseudoscientific notion of science and modernity, and apparently this was so inflammatory to this classical architecture professor that he walked out of the lecture. You know, in my memory, the people that were the most dogmatic were actually liked the material, but didn't like the direction it was going in. Whereas, I mean, for architecture moving forward, I feel like, at least for me, the research on ornament is not just about form. It's a lot of it is about culture, which is a whole aspect that I haven't even, you know, really touched upon here. But just going back to Dali, for example, one of his major project was to, and remember this is mid 1850s, 60s, to find a way out of architecture which automatically represents or automatically recalls or acts as a symbol for aristocratic representations. They're very much in a kind of post-revolutionary mode, and he explicitly says, how do we make architecture and ornament that is for the bourgeois? Meaning for him, right? For the new class of which he and most architects of the 19th century, I would say almost all architects were implicitly a part of. And that question has never really been answered. I feel like the whole banishment and formal dogmatism works as a way to cover over that kind of cultural question. Was there a failure to deliver a style that actually represented that? And you can see this kind of conflict even in people like Loos, you know, who on the one hand discriminates against ornament in a really kind of irrational way, and then on the other hand, you know, he says something like, it's our duty to dress as aristocrats because now we can, now we are able to, right? So we kind of for me, that's how I kind of not get around the question, but sort of answer it with another question, which is, you know, well, there's tons of issues that haven't been resolved yet, and then that's where I think the interest is, and that's also it concerns the kind of sociology of architecture, perhaps more than the, you know, design of it even. I know that doesn't answer your question directly, but again, I also haven't been you know, really challenged in terms of being dismissed in on those terms. So maybe I will. Maybe I'll have to prepare for that confrontation someday.
Oh, Gary, that I have so many follow-up questions to that. Really great points there. Maybe we can get to them. But I do want to give Dana a chance to, Dana Carwas a chance to ask her question. Did you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for this wonderful dialogue. So Gary shared Haeckel's visions and subsequent illustrations, and they showed the species as a hyper-distilled version of an observation, removing it from the space or time that it existed in or exists in, hiding, in most cases, the imperfections that one would see with their naked eye. And this brings up questions around inscription and translation, and on the digital side of this, and the digital ornament that we see in design processes shared by Matt is distilled by the hyper-technical fabrication tools of our time. How do movement and forces, possibly such as our ability to see them now and model them in time with these kind of incredible simulation software packages, Houdini, all of these kind of scientific modeling, advanced scientific modeling techniques, and the ability to see something in time, how does this play into the refracted or future idea of ornament?
Yeah, maybe I'll leave the production aspect of the question to Matt, but for the Haeckel part, it's a really interesting observation. I was just thinking as you're asking that, actually Haeckel's or Binet's relationship to Haeckel, to me, is like a really classical relationship, and he's kind of a really lucky and opportunistic guy who basically came across this treasure trove of new natural forms. I mean, one could make the general argument and that people were sort of maybe a little bit bored with drawing you know, the same lotus leaf for centuries, and all of a sudden at the end of the 19th century, this guy dumps 400 plates of, you know, never before seen never before seen naturalistic images, and so I think for Binet, it's almost like it's almost like a kid in the candy store in a way. So I think he's not really looking beyond what was already known to classically trained architects at the time. It's just that he kind of capitalized on the situation. So, but you're absolutely right that even amongst the scientific community, like in that Science article that I quoted, you know, people had a real problem with the way that Hegel presented these objects as if they were, you know, isolated from any kind of relationship to environment or each other, or some kind of developmental narrative, or anything really. I mean, the term despotism is pretty strong to describe what he was doing, I think. And yeah, so Matt, I'll leave it to you to talk about the fabrication part.
Well, I mean, I think in terms, it's a great question, and thanks for that. I think in terms of the sort of modern and contemporary fabrication, you know, I think about some of the people in the past who were heavy into it, and Nikos mentioned, you know, Louis Sullivan, Wright could certainly be in there, but I also kind of think about like the amount of labor that went into certain things prior to them, even, for example, like Michelangelo. You know, he had a number of unfinished works, and part of me wonders, you know, if he had access to some of the machinery that we have now, how many of those things could he have finished? Because at a certain point, you know, he's not actually doing the breaking of the stone from the giant block down to the thing. He's just finishing the edges of it, and I think that's one way to combine, you know, technology with a human hand. I think we ought to always have a human hand, a human touch at the very end. You know, that I think that indicates to the viewer that you know, that someone has imbued care and love into this thing, and there's sort of a reflection back into the built environment of the fact that there's a human mind there, and that some way the human mind has tried to make something that other people can appreciate, and I think that's measurable. And I'm curious to see what kind of scientific experiments could be crafted to understand that. But at the same time, there's no reason why we have to have people who are doing all the heavy lifting or the heavy machinery, those aspects that we now have access to. So, you know, refracting into the future, you know, we can take advantage of all of the dumb work, the sort of like brute force work, via machines, the repetition, that sort of repetition over and over and over that's afforded by a machine through precision, and then finishing by hand, and still employ, you know, thousands of people to do this work, and put it together, but also take advantage of modern technology in digital fabrication. I don't know if that answers your question specifically, but
Matt, I'm just curious to follow up a little bit on Dana's question. I think you talked a little bit about the fabrication aspect, but I am very curious about sort of the second aspect, which is our ability to model and understand nature in new ways. I think if we were to produce a catalog of nature in 2021, it would be very different from you know, the catalogs that Gary showed us. Yeah. It would be looking at forces, abstract diagrams, DNA, you know, complete quantum mechanics, and I thought it was fascinating the way that your presentation had in it, you know, turbulent flows and black holes. I think it's fascinating that all these things do reduce down to the patterns that we've been using for millennia, and I think there's a beauty in that. But I wonder, do you see anything new coming out of that, or is it just a different approach, sort of to that connection between ornament and our understanding of the world and the cosmos?
yeah, great question. I think in a way, you know, the more we find out at the multitude of scales that we've been finding them out in nature, so to be able to look closer and closer through electron microscopes or whatever the case may be, we find the same thing, right? That you see at a certain scale, and that goes back to the fractal quality. That goes back to Mandelbrot's, you know, kind of repeating scale over and over. But there's no end, I think, there to what we can find. So I think in one of my presentations, I have like a electron microscope photograph of like a mosquito's foot, right? And it's incredible. It's absolutely, it's got like big long toes and like all these things. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's a mosquito's foot. So, you know, I think we're looking at diatoms, and I think, you know, Gary, you had a few slides there that kind of showed that sort of exploration of these like incredible geometric and symmetrical, you know, single cell beings and that sort of thing. But we can start to look even closer at the sort of the hairs on a bee, you know, and I had a photo of the imbrication on a butterfly wing, you know, and sure, you can see that at a larger scale because it is that sort of self-similarity repeating over and over. But I think as we just kind of discover that there's more complexity in nature that we may not even be able to perceive at a certain level, but that we have tools that allow us to explore, that like, hey, you know, the universe is the limit there. So.
Yeah, it's beautiful to think how ornament might have a role in communicating some of those discoveries. I think that's really powerful.
I think also, I mean, all this technology and microscopes and telescopes, you know, all these ways of seeing allow us to kind of break away from historical tropes that we're used to, like the lotus and the button.
Yeah, the lotus is beautiful, but hey, why are we copying? You know, we got the whole world as our oyster, right? And many principles and proportions to work from. You know, one of the things that I really like about looking more closely at elements is the sort of combination and recombination across scales that allows for this creation of new ornament that's still based in natural form. So it could be abstracted, but it still has that sort of relation to what we're experiencing, and that fractal quality that we understand kind of gives that benefit back to us.
So it looks like Christina had a question. Christina, I know you said you were on your phone, or would you be interested in unmuting to ask, or do you want us to read it? All right, I think, why don't we go ahead and read it?
Sorry, you can go ahead and read it. Thanks.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Historically, in terms of antiquity, what was the original and function purpose of ornament?
Function.
Yeah, function. Beyond style, does function symbolic to a few and many? Does this change over time on a basic and foundational level? Yeah. Was it a balance of symbolic, decorative in ancient Greece as it was in the 17th century, for example?
I think this is actually a question that Kent should weigh in on.
Really.
I agree.
What do you think, Kent?
Oh yeah, let me unmute Kent. Do I have that power?
I think
I can ask him.
Mute.
Yeah,
Okay,
he's
Karen,
unmuted.
hello.
Hi, Kent.
Oh, yeah. You know, I do have a comment. But thank the speakers. It was a great evening. My comment is that people love ornament. I'm absolutely amazed at how many people are interested in the subject, because I can't stop talking about it. And whether it's at some sort of dinner somewhere or just in a train or wherever, if it turns around to a discussion on ornament, what I have discerned is that there's a tremendous amount of interest in it. And that leads to an examination of why isn't there more of it? And that's going to take a long time to answer, but it's not because there is not an interest. It's because of blockage that exists on several scales in the production of buildings and communities that, right from the banking or the loaning system right through to very largely the education that specialists that are involved on that chain have been involved in. But I mean, it would take me far too long to continue what I'm talking about. And all I really want to say is that there is a tremendous interest in the subject and in the production of ornament. So what we have to do is pull the plugs out of the things that are blocking it. It's not really a complex socio-moral question. There is interest. And we have to facilitate that interest in all the sort of institutions and instruments in charge of the way things get built. That's the one thing that I kept thinking about.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I guess to maybe also my thoughts to address Christina's question a little bit. I mean, one way to, it's really difficult to say that you know, nothing has changed since antiquity, or some aspect hasn't changed, or you kind of have to look on a case by case basis. But I think that one, if you want to call it a function, one function that speaks to maybe a role that ornament has played, I think can simply be called differentiation. To make a variety, to make something different from the next. And I think that's something that can be observed in many different cultures and to many different effects. And it has an aesthetic component. It definitely has I think there's a strong argument for a kind of basic desire to make things different, to artistically innovate. At the same time, one has to, I think about the fact that with differentiation comes also social and cultural differentiation. So you'll observe, for example, in Chinese temples, or palaces, the number of columns and the type of decoration is strictly controlled. It's about class, essentially, and those things were also very much apparent, I would say. For example, in 19th century Paris, where people were trying to take the ornaments from the interior of Charles Garnier's opera Garnier and put them on the outside of their apartment buildings, for example, to show a kind of relationship between my bourgeois lifestyle and the kind of the theater that is the cultural center, one of the icons of the world. So I would say that yeah, one has to look at multifaceted. One has to take a multifaceted view of it. Yeah.
Well, I do invite anyone to type in additional questions in the chat here. I thought I'd just jump off of what Gary said, because this is the second time he's referred to the history and the intertwining of ornament and class. And I find that very fascinating in the context of these books of biology that I think in a way are allowing an escape. You know, like we have these entrenched botanical symbols like the fleur-de-lis, for example, in France, which is so connected with royalty and class that you can't separate it from that association. And I think in bringing in diatoms and these redbud into the conversation on ornament, you kind of liberate it in a way from these entrenched associations. And it's interesting too to me to think about, you know, Matt is in the sort of birthplace of, we could say, an American school of ornament, and we can disagree perhaps about this, but I think of Sullivan's ornament as very much democratic in the sense that it's not using symbols of royalty or class. It's using often Native American not Native American, but native to America vegetation in order to create these motifs that are of their place. So I don't know if do you guys think that sort of going directly from nature? I know, Matt, it's interesting because in your presentation, you talked about how the ornament you produce even has both extrinsic and intrinsic qualities, and that it does have symbolic and perhaps cultural and class associations to those who are in the know, but it's also universal. So I don't know if you guys could talk about that a little more, sort of the class implications, the universality of it, and sort of what the influx of motifs from biology might contribute to that.
Well, I mean, I certainly agree that you know, Sullivan was working, you know, in a way to try and create a system that anybody could apply, and that system was, you know, I mean, as I'm sure many know better than I do, kind of it had its roots, you know, in sort of Frank Furness. You know, I think he did a little bit of a Cole Beaux-Arts study, you know, but he started to adapt his early stuff that was kind of a Romanesque, you know, very conventionalized, you know, plant form into this sort of principle. And you can even see in the panel behind me, like those plants don't exist anywhere. They're just kind of natural leaf forms that kind of emerge from these energy lines that he would establish through this geometric patterning. And I think that's one way of looking at it in a you know, a small d democratic, you know, process whereby, you know, it's accessible to anyone, and is, you know, and it doesn't signify a hierarchy, but rather just imbues a beauty. And I love that idea that that we have the ability now, you know, to kind of break those stereotypes, or break the, you know, those preformed ideas over like who can afford it and who it belongs to and what it signifies, and let anyone have access to it. Beauty for all is what I say. You know, and I think ornament is the way to do it. I imagine most people would agree. They may not think it's architectural ornament. I happen to, but you know, there's an expression in the way we dress, in the way we decorate our homes, you know, in the way we carry ourselves, you know, that should extend to the places where we live and do business. And I think we can convince. The idea, at least that I have, is that we can use science to prove that ornament is beneficial in a way that makes it almost like something like the ADA. We legislate for the physical safety of people through codes, through fire codes, through, you know, accessibility codes, et cetera. Why are we not legislating in a way for the cognitive welfare of people? And that doesn't mean it's like prescriptive, just saying like it has to have something that provides a benefit. And to me, that's ornament. And I think that should be, you know, we should be looking after people's minds as well as their bodies.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on that, and also on Misha's question, and also on Sullivan in particular, I would argue that the oak leaf, instead of the acanthus or the lotus, is a very deliberate move, and very much differentiates one set of architecture from another. If we read the autobiography of an idea, which is written at the end of Sullivan's life, and you know, he wasn't doing that well during that period, it sort of reads as quite angry. but when he talks about the Chicago Great Exposition, you know, the passages there are all about. They can come off as almost nationalistic in a way, where he kind of says, you know, accuses Burnham and Root and on all these other architects of being consumed by what he calls the European virus, right? Which is the copying of French eclecticism essentially all across American cities. But I would say that it's not really a nationalism that argues for an American supremacy, but one that argues for a differentiation, where we are, you know, we must have our own art, and so it's really interesting. And I mean, I think he tries to express that in his ornament. I think he succeeds in doing that it does not look like something out of the École des Beaux-Arts, right? It's something different.
So
yeah,
just to sort of complement that, Gary, you know, Sullivan and Burnham didn't get along. I mean, they got along, but they, you know, and Burnham, of course, had all the success that he's had all over the world, and Sullivan, you know, posthumously, but he was sort of penniless in the hotel, died a drunkard, right? Begging for money from other people. And it's kind of a sad story, but, you know, I think he was particularly upset about the Columbian Exposition because it was one of his buildings that helped win Chicago the fair. and in the auditorium theater. And in that building in particular, which I'm pleased to say was the thing that made me become an architect. I went to a show there when I was 10 or 11, Phantom of the Opera, and I couldn't get enough of the building details. I was wandering around, ushered back to my seat a few times, and now I'm on the board there and the chair of the facilities committee, so it's kind of near and dear to my heart. But this idea that Sullivan's one of his great first masterpieces won the fair for Chicago over New York and St. Louis, I think. And then they picked sort of like the classical, the Greco-Roman classical, the kind of out of the French, and I think that was particularly stuck in his craw his entire career, because he was relegated to doing one building, which he bucked the system and did with color.
Another example that came to my mind on a similar phenomenon is a now already destroyed apartment building in Paris by an architect who died very young. I think he died in his 20s or early 30s, called Xavier Shokov. Was a Russian-born French architect, and he was active kind of in the Art Nouveau period, and he designed a house for a cabaret singer named Yvette Gilbert, who and in this house all the ornaments, which is richly ornamented, but all of them derive from songs written by the singer, and she uses a lot of imagery, flowers and trees and birds and whatnot from in her songs, which are kind of drawn from her working class childhood, and she kind of made it in Paris and became a big star. But all of the ornament inside of her home was designed by this architect to be derived from her, essentially. And it was kind of like the pinnacle of like I think, like, if Dali had been alive to see it, he probably would have called it modern architecture. But unfortunately, I think the building has since been turned into the Iranian embassy, I think, in Paris. And the facade was, torn down and replaced with a really drab kind of Haussmannian thing. But
speaks to the level of design that they would turn it into an embassy.
Yeah. But I mean, it's somewhat similar. I mean, that's a tragic story, and Sullivan's a tragic story, and it could be a situation where the economics of the time just did not fit did not support the level of individuation that could have made it universal. And when I wonder, going back to the kind of fabrication question, whether or not that might change with today's technology. Whether it would be possible now or more possible now.
We have technology that's improved every other aspect of life. In some ways, it's ruined other aspects of life.
Yeah.
Cell phone. Yeah. We're using it in every other aspect of life. There's no reason why we shouldn't be using it to beautify our buildings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. Or kind of one of those meandering thoughts. So I spent a good bit of time a while back just staring at the pages of Owen Jones and Racine and Dolmish, and there's always that one section that they call the primitive culture section. And I thought it was always fascinating because this was the particular section that was the most abstract and most geometric out of all of them in terms of the ornament portrayed. And it just makes me kind of, this is just my own theorizing, just makes me think how interesting it is that today, the most prominent design desires are about abstraction and clean lines and whatnot. And I guess I'm not really making a connection between the two necessarily, but I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on the importance of abstraction in ornament and what, I guess, where to draw the line and what how that has what that has to do with decorum and style, and perhaps in your own design, Matt. Yeah.
I found that I actually get the opportunity to work quite a bit from kind of local cultural precedents and references, and so it's always kind of enjoyable and fun to go back and look at some of these much older, ways that they were kind of decorating pottery or creating fabrics or creating kind of stamped, pressed wood with a kind of block stamps, wood blocks, etc. And it's interesting how much of that geometry you find across multiple cultures that supposedly had no interaction with each other, right? And I think that goes back to sort of an intuitive structure of our brain, right? That kind of speaks to sort of the qualities that fractals bring when we reach that correct range. It's kind of the resonation, or it resonates within our brain. And then there's another aspect. There's a bit about psychopharmacology with regard to imagery that we see in the moments between sleep and awake. And it's usually a very geometric kind of patterning that will get this sort of entoptic phenomena that happen. And it happens, I guess, the same way to everyone. So I think built into our sort of neural structure is an appreciation of repeating a geometric form, which, then you see expressed across all of these cultures. And I think that just comes from evolving in nature and appreciating what nature has at her base, which is, a geometry, not a Euclidean geometry necessarily, but a geometry that kind of structures everything for us, whether or not we realize it.
I mean, I think that a lot of primitive, quote unquote, primitive, that word, I don't really want to use it for Moen Jones, but a lot of cultures that are connected to the land often include psychedelics and trance and dream experiences as part of their artistic production. And I think it's fascinating to think that a lot of these sort of repeating patterns, you say, are built into that state between dreaming and wakefulness. And that state is precisely what so many traditional shamans, perhaps as a blanket statement, I'll say, sort of try to achieve. And mandalas and sort of a lot of these ornaments that evolve around that. That's really interesting.
A lot of it is used in an epitropaic way, where you're decorating a surface as a protective element, right? So you see lots of sword hilts that are carved and shields that have decoration all over them, and it's this idea that you're taking a larger energy force and you're imbuing it into this structure that then is meant to protect you. The geometric patterns that go all around the door frames of Celtic and Norwegian, and many other cultures. One theory has it that, evil spirits desiring control over all things must find the beginning and the end of the line. And if you can't find the beginning and the end of the line, then you can't pass through the portal. And so you put it around your door as this sort of protective way, and so I do believe, this inherent structure within us that we kind of can get in touch through trance and other kind of states, or that was given to us through shaman experiences, etc. People have used in a way to protect themselves and decorate with the idea of protection in mind.
The true function of ornament. Christina was asking about the function of ornament. There's one.
There you go. There's one.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that's really fascinating, and the fact that a lot of these more ancient cultures were using ornament not necessarily to replicate, as we see in Renaissance or later ornament. You're not really replicating belief or conventionalizing it, but instead it's almost this aura, this almost magical thing, as you're saying, talismans. And I think that speaks a lot to the state of humanity. And where are we now? That's my question.
Well, I see that Nikos has a comment he'd like to. I'd love to hear what you have to say, but I'd just add to that real quick. When we're talking about healthcare structures, and this idea that fractal exposure to nature or fractal qualities can improve recovery time, can like lessen pain. Like there's a bunch of studies that show this in addition to this idea of wayfinding through confusing medical complexes, all of these elements that kind of reduce our stress levels in one of the most stressful environments in the world, and potentially provide, cognitive benefit, increased mental acuity for the doctors and the nurses, et cetera, et cetera. And you kind of look back and you say, like, they were taking decorative motifs and they're putting around door frames to protect themselves. And we might use that in our modern day hospitals, not to protect ourselves, but rather to like enhance, the outcome. And I mean, it's like, it raises the hair on my arms, really, is what it does. But
it's still protection from
sure,
evil forces, right? Just a very different.
I think we need to reinstate the belief in, supernatural sort of magical things like that.
Yeah.
Just a little more curiosity in the world.
I have some thoughts about that, but I really want Nikos to get a chance to speak.
Yes, please,
Oh, so can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Well, yeah, here is where I think that Owen Jones got everything wrong. As an expression of the social philosophy of his time, actually, so I don't blame him at all. But the raw and more geometrical ornaments, I wouldn't call them abstract, I would call them geometrical and the more mathematical. You see the pure mathematical forms of the different types of symmetries that occur, and those are closer to our neurophysiology, because those are directly have a direct mathematical expression. Therefore, it is not a surprise that all cultures all around the world have developed those elements of ornamentation, because those are common to the human brain, which we share with all species of humans around the world. Now, going on from there, cultures develop more and more ornamentation until the point where some cultures become degenerate and they just pile up too much ornament. So some of 19th century ornament is in fact just too much. It's, ornament upon ornament upon ornament, and then it breaks away from the mathematics. It is no longer coherent because it's just too much and it is unrelated. It is no longer a fractal. Okay, so even the most complex fractal is related. The larger and the intermediate and the smaller scales are all related. But no, some ornament that is just too rich, it gives you a stomach ache. Some ornament is too rich, and that's the degenerate type of ornament. And that's not a reason to ban ornament like these lunatics did in the beginning of the 20th century. But so I would recommend that the more visceral type of geometrical ornament is really what we connect to the most strongly, and that's where the lessons are. And unfortunately, Owen Jones put those in the beginning and says, well, these are primitive and we evolved from there. I disagree with that statement, but I understand why he said it.
I think to your point, Nikos, there's a reason why Rococo is often referred to as frosting, because it makes you sick to your stomach if you get too much of it.
We should move along.
Yeah. Do you want to say goodbye?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kent. Kent is, I think, a big reason why all of us are here today. So thank you for inspiring all of us and for catalyzing this conversation, which we hope is going to continue beyond the confines of this colloquium and spill out. And please, everyone on the call, bring ornament into your world in any way you can.
New
share
revolution.
back with us. If anyone wants to stay on the call, I realize we've been at it for 2 hours, so you need to move on, feel free. And if you want to keep chatting ornament, you're welcome to stay on.
And if you want to reach out to us, just go to the Yale Ornament .wordpress.com. You can reach us through there. Yeah, further questions.
Yeah, you can also find Yale Ornament Colloquium on Facebook.
Yeah.
So please do reach out. We're hoping that we can continue these conversations in some form in the future. So please do let us know.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
it's so hard to say goodbye. This is a topic I love.
People are slowly trickling out.
Thank you, Misha and Kat, so much for organizing all this and you know, providing opportunity for the discourse and the learning and all those things. It's really it's been quite enjoyable. I kind of wish it was weekly.
Well, we can arrange that.
We can start a little group.
Yeah.
I would love that.
Yeah, you know, I think outside of the formal, you know, big events like this, it's great to have a kind of dialogue because, you know, as much as we love to say that everyone loves ornament, I always feel like we're in a bit of a little niche here. And it's always good to expand the niche.
Yeah.
The beauty of Zoom is that we can do it.
It's true.
Across continents and places. I have so many follow-up questions to you guys, but I just want to say thank you so much for creating something that melded so well.
Yeah, that was just fantastic. Truly.
All right, guys, I'm gonna get some breakfast.
And I'm gonna get some dinner. So there we go.
I'm really tired.
Thank you, Gary, also for getting up so early.
No worries.
Yeah, it's great.
Actually, it wasn't as bad as I thought.
And I hope your talk becomes a paper that we can read in the near future. Because it's
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I think, yeah, the problem is that people have all written about individual parts of it. So I don't know if bringing it all together actually constitutes original research, but we'll see.
Well, like any development of ornament, the first pass is the last pass. Should never be the last pass, right? So you kind of, as you bring it all together, I'm sure something will come, right?
Yeah.
So no, but it was totally fascinating. Thanks, Gary. Really appreciate it.
You've inspired me.
Yours too.
Yours too. That Wacom tablet and
oh wow, yeah.
do some sketching on it.
The tablet is it's a game changer, really. So.
So fast.
You've got to put it in an ergonomic position on your desk though, because it creates some real kinks if you're working on long hours. So that's my main recommendation.
Sure.
But thanks again, really appreciate it. And let's stay in touch. I have a whole bunch of questions for you, Gary, so I'll try to put them into an email.
Yeah. Let's go back and forth for sure.
Yeah, I have a lot of notes that I'd love to follow up on, you guys.
Yeah.
So, no, I like the idea of a future recurring ornament discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm game. I'm always game. So.
Perfect. All right. Good morning. Good night.
Good morning. Yeah. Be well.
Good night.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.